In chapter 44, we're going to move into learning about communities and ecosystems. And we are going to learn about how we study those communities and how we study those ecosystems. You are welcome to pause the video at any time if you need to catch up on taking notes or just pause to reflect on what we are covering. We're going to start off talking about species richness and diversity, and this is a measure of the number of organisms of different types in their particular areas. Then we're going to talk about how that affects the stability or the balance within an ecosystem, and then we'll move into how those communities change. We're actually going to skip the section on island biogeography, although of course this is available if you find it interesting and would like to learn a little bit about it. Then after that, we will shift more towards ecosystems, where we will talk mostly about energy and how energy is transferred within an ecosystem. So we'll talk about initially communities, ecosystem, and diversity within those communities. So a community is essentially all of the living populations, all of the living organisms that are found in a particular area. So when we were talking about population ecology, we were talking about just one particular group of organisms, one species in a particular area. And here we're going to add in those other populations and talk about how communities interact. We did already talk a little bit about some of those interactions between specific populations. So for example, predator-prey relationships. But really what we're doing with the community ecology here is moving into bigger, broader communities and less specific species interactions. So in chapter 43, we talked about populations and specific ways in which populations or types of organisms interact. Here we're going to focus on a broader discussion of communities and how communities as a whole function, not just the interactions between one or two types of organisms in that community. So just like populations, we can study communities at a wide variety of scales. So for example, you might look at the community of soil organisms in your garden, or you might look at the community of organisms that are in your backyard. Just depends on what you are looking for and what it is that you need to study. Once we define our community for our study, then we can start thinking about the ecology that happens there, or the interactions and functions amongst those different living organisms in that community. So when we're doing community ecology, we're really studying how they interact, how those organisms interact in the community, and how they function. Towards the end of the chapter, we'll switch to ecosystems. So ecosystems are sort of everything that you could study, all of the interactions of the living organisms in that community, and also their physical environment. Now, the organism might interact with that physical environment. They might change it. So if they're using the physical environment to build a habitat, or to build a space in which they can live, they might be directly interacting with it, or they might just be affected by it. So we're going to be looking at both the living or the biotic aspects of a community, and also the non-living or abiotic aspects of a community. And most of what we're looking for when we study community ecology is actually the flow of energy, potentially the flow of nutrients through that particular system. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how energy moves through an ecosystem. For most organisms, this is going to be related to how they feed. What do they eat? Where does it come from? And which direction is energy being transferred? One of the most important aspects of a community is the number of species in it, but not just the number of species in it, but also their distribution. What is the relative abundance of a particular species compared to another? Are there a lot of one type, or are they evenly distributed? And so there are two different factors that go into determining how much diversity we have in a particular environment. We're going to start with species richness. So species richness is just the number of species in a community. It's a raw number. You just total up the number of different species. For this, we are not looking for the number of individuals of each species, just the number of species. So this might be the number of different mammals that you find on an Illinois prairie, and it might include the amphibians or the reptiles that you find on that prairie, the different types of plants you find, the different types of trees, any fungi that you might find in that community. The number of species that you have in a community is going to vary within that community. And it varies on a local scale, and it also varies on a regional or even a global scale. So there are a few patterns that we tend to see. We usually see that as we move from the tropics to our polar regions, so here we've got Central America down here at the bottom, and up at the top we've got northern North America. And then we've got this gradation of species richness. Now down here in Central America, we've got our highest species richness. And we're always going to find our highest species richness near the tropics. And we'll talk about why that is in a later lecture. But essentially it's related to temperature and sunlight. So where we've got the most sunlight, we've also got warmer temperatures. And where we've got the most sunlight, we have the most plants, which are going to support the largest ecosystem because plants equate to energy in the living world. So down in Central America, tropical regions of the Americas, we have the highest species richness. And then as we move up towards our poles, you can see these numbers on species richness. As we move up towards the pole, those poles, it's going to decrease a little bit. So we start down here in the 600s, 600 species in a particular area. Then as we get higher up, we start getting 70s, 40s, and 50s. You'll notice there are some other trends as well. We have very high species richness in mountains. So as we increase elevation, our temperatures become more moderate, and we tend to have a little bit more species diversity in those areas as well. So depending on the topography or the landscape in a particular area, we can also change our species diversity. And then weather in a local region helps as well. So there's a lot of rainfall in the tropics. In the American Southeast, we also have a decent amount of rainfall, but not as much mountains. So it just kind of depends on where you are in a particular area. We may also have something called the peninsula effect. So if we look at Florida down here, we'll see that our species richness actually decreases towards the end of the peninsula. So what's happening here is that animals or plants, whatever organisms we're looking at, are spreading out from areas of high diversity as they colonize those peninsulas. Now the environments on those peninsulas become less diverse. So if you think about pretty much all of Florida, it's pretty hot, pretty rainy all year. There's not a lot of diversity in temperature. But as you move farther away from Florida, you increase in both climate diversity and topographical or landscape diversity. And those are also going to contribute to the different types of organisms that can survive in those areas. Because if you have more diversity in the environment, you get an increased species richness. And that's simply because the environment can provide more available resources, more variety of resources, and therefore can attract a greater variety of organisms. Our second measure in a community is a measure of species diversity. Now, species diversity is actually a very complicated calculation. We are not going to do the calculation here, but species diversity is going to directly affect the stability of a community. Now, diversity and richness are going to sound like they're the same thing, and they kind of are. So species richness was the number of species in a community. Species diversity takes into account species richness, or the number of different species, but it also takes into account species evenness, or the relative abundance of each species. So when we start talking about species diversity, we're talking about both the number of different species and how many individuals of each species there are. Now, as I said, this can actually be calculated as a numerical value, and we use something called a Shannon index. And that would really be something that you learn in an ecology course, which, by the way, SWIC offers a ecology course in our biology department if that is something you are interested in. We are not going to do the calculations for the Shannon index. I'm just going to tell you that the general trend is that as you increase diversity in your community, you're also going to increase resilience. And the reason that species diversity is important is because in a diverse ecosystem with lots of different species distributed in a balanced way, that community, that ecosystem is generally going to be more resilient when it is faced with disturbances or stresses, and also more productive. And when we say productive, we mean energy. So the more diverse plants you have in the environment, the more energy you can collect and the more organisms you can support with that energy. So we have two different communities here, and this table is basically showing you the species diversity. So in community A, we have 2 species. So that would be our richness. We have 2 species. And then we also have the number of individuals. So that's going to be our evenness, or how many individuals of each type are present. So we said that an ecosystem that has a more balanced distribution of species is going to be more resilient and more productive. So if we look at community A, we see that their richness is the same as community B. We have 2 species in each community, but community A is almost exclusively species 1. And there's only 1 individual of species 2. Whereas community B is a relatively even distribution of each type. So therefore, community B has greater diversity. Now this is a pretty obvious example because we have essentially 0 of one and equal distribution of the others. But the reason that we use this Shannon index value is that it would allow us to essentially get a statistical calculation for species diversity. So we can set a value for any community that's in between basically almost zero diversity and completely even diversity. So species diversity is important because of this diversity stability hypothesis. This hypothesis says that species-rich communities, so when we have more species in a community, but also when they're evenly distributed, are more stable when faced with ecological disturbances. So those ecological disturbances can be regular occurrences. So it could be something like a hurricane on the Gulf Coast, or it could be a drought in the Midwest. It could be a forest fire. It could be a whole variety of different disturbances. But the diversity stability hypothesis says that the higher your species richness and diversity, the more resilient that community is going to be. The more likely it is to bounce back quickly from a disturbance. So that's not to say that there would never be a massive disturbance, but what it is telling us is that when we have a moderate disturbance, it is not a big deal if we have high species diversity. That the number of individuals and the number of types of individuals in a particular area are going to be able to bounce back quickly. And so if we looked at a community that had far lower richness and far lower diversity, they're not going to be able to bounce back as quickly. And you would see a greater shift in the makeup of that community. On the right, we have a graph that shows average plant richness. And then on the side, we have what we call the coefficient of variation for plant community biomass. So basically what this means is that as we have more richness over here, our biomass is actually going to decrease.